Welcome back to Verbal Sparring and welcome to the State of the UFC August 28th, 2025 edition. If you are new to the channel, this is a monthly video series where we go through and take a look back at all of the action in the past month. So for example, this video will feature all 4 events that happened in the month of August for the UFC. We will take a look at each card in depth by the numbers in terms of fights, finishes, weight classes, etc. Talk about how the rankings were directly impacted in the aftermath of each card. Discuss any UFC newcomers that got victories in their debuts. We'll take a peek at where the pound for pound rankings sit as we head into the month of September, and we'll even tally up all the numbers together and look at the totals from this past month. So without further ado, let's jump into the action, and it starts with UFC Vegas 108 at the UFC Apex, the return to the Apex for the first time in 2 months at that point for the company, where we would see Tatsuro Taira take on short notice opponent Hyung-Sung Park. And you'll notice a trend here when I talk about how many fights are on this card, because you're going to hear me say that exact same number for each event this past month, which is the first time that has happened so far. And that is 12 fights. That is what each and every single card in the month of August tallied, and it started with UFC Vegas 108, and of those 12 fights, we would see 7 decisions and 5 finishes, 3 of them by knockout and 2 submissions. There was 1 knockout and 1 submission each in the first round, 2 knockouts in the second, and 1 submission in the second, and of the 7 decisions, 6 of them were unanimous and 1 split. We would see 4 weight classes with 2 fights and 4 weight classes with 1 fight. Middleweight, lightweight, featherweight, and flyweight would host 2, and welterweight, bantamweight, women's bantamweight, and strawweight would host 1. Tatsuro Taira defended his top 10 ranking in the flyweight division by not only beating Hyung-Sung Park, but submitting him in the second round, and he would actually rise up 1 spot, although Park was an unranked prospect, from 6 to 5, meaning that Kai Kara-France would have to drop from 5 to 6. And we would see Carol Hossa defend her top 10 spot in the women's bantamweight division by earning a unanimous decision win over Nora Cornell. Much like Tatsuro Taira, Carol Rosa would switch places 1 spot up with Yana Santos from 10 to 9 and vice versa. And next we head to UFC Vegas 109, where we will stay in the same venue at the Apex in Las Vegas, but just move up a few weight classes in the main event, as we would see Roman Dolidze take on Anthony Hernandez. Of the 12 fights on this card, we also saw 7 decisions again, but this time a little bit more even, with 4 unanimous and 3 split. And of the finishes, there were 4 knockouts and 1 submission. The lone submission would happen in the 4th round. It was the main event championship rounds where Fluffy Hernandez would submit Roman Dolidze, and all 4 knockouts happened in round 1. The bantamweight division would hold 3 fights on this night. The light heavyweight and middleweight division would each have 2, and the welterweight, featherweight, women's bantamweight, women's flyweight, and strawweight divisions would all have 1 fight. Anthony Hernandez launched himself into the top 10 of the middleweight division by extending his win streak to 8 after that 4th round submission over Dolidze, and to be specific, he would climb 3 spots up from 10 to 7. Roman Dolidze would drop 2 spots from 9 to 11. Then we would see the number 7 ranked Robert Whittaker drop to 8, the number 8 ranked Jared Cannonier drop to 9, and the number 11 ranked Brendan Allen rise up 1 spot to 10. Yasmin Lucindo got the biggest win of her career, arguably, by defeating Angela Hill, the longtime veteran, via decision, and Yasmin would rise 1 spot from 8 to 7, which would then cause Tabitha Ricci to drop from 7 to 8, and the 8th ranked Jillian Roberson to drop to 9. Next we move to UFC 319, the lone pay-per-view of the month of August, where the UFC would return to Chicago, Illinois for the first time since 2019. On this card, we would see 7 finishes with 4 knockouts and 3 submissions, and 5 decisions, with all 5 of them being unanimous. All 4 knockouts would once again come in the first round, much like UFC Vegas 109, and all 3 submissions would happen in the second round. The middleweight division would hold 4 fights on this night, including the main event for the title. Lightweight and flyweight would have 2 fights each, and welterweight, featherweight, women's flyweight, and strawweight would all have 1 fight. And as you would expect out of any pay-per-view card, there was a lot of movement in the UFC rankings, and it started in that middleweight division as the number 3 ranked Khamzat Chimaev would dominate Dricus du Plessis en route to becoming the new champion of the world. Dricus would of course drop from champion label to number 1, the number 1 ranked Nassourdine Imavov would drop to number 2, and the number 2 ranked former champion Sean Strickland would drop to number 3. Lerone Murphy got the biggest win of his career, and definitely in the most impactful fashion, as he would get the spinning back elbow knockout against Aaron Pico in round 1, and that would allow for Lerone to remain undefeated and rise up from number 6 to number 4 in the featherweight rankings, knocking on the door of a championship fight with Alexander Volkanovski. That would then force Brian Ortega and Arnold Allen to each drop 1 spot to number 5 and number 6 respectively. And much like Lerone Murphy, Carlos Prates in the welterweight division would also secure a spinning back elbow, and that was against the 11th ranked Jeff Neal that happened with 1 second left in the opening round. Carlos would rise 3 spots up from number 12 to number 9, bouncing back from his loss to Ian Machado Gary earlier in the year. Jeff Neal would drop one spot from 11 to 12, and then the 9th ranked Colby Covington would drop to number 10, and the 10th ranked Gilbert Burns would drop to number 11. Back to the middleweight division we go, as Michael Venom Page, who was ranked 15th in the welterweight division heading into UFC 319, would get a victory over former middleweight title challenger Jared Cannonier. As a result, Michael Page would be removed from the welterweight rankings, but that's okay because he would catapult himself to the number 10 spot in the 185-pound ranks. Jared Cannonier would drop 2 spots from 9 to 11, Brendan Allen would bump up from 10 to 9, and then Roman Dolidze, Paulo Costa, and Marvin Vettori, who were ranked 11, 12, and 13, would all drop to 12, 13, and 14. Tim Elliott got a big win over fellow former title challenger Kaya Sakura, where he would submit him in round 2. That would allow Tim to rise 1 spot from 11 to 10, switching places with Steve Erceg, another former title challenger. Lupi Godinez got the biggest win of her career by taking out the former champion Jessica Andrade via decision, and heading into UFC 319, Lupi was ranked number 11, and in the aftermath she would rise up 5 spots all the way up to number 6. Andrade would drop 4 spots from 5 to 9, Mackenzie Dern would be bumped up from 6 to 5, Jillian Roberson would drop from 9 to 10, and the 10th ranked Amanda Hebos would drop to number 11. And lastly, in the women's flyweight division, Karine Silva would defeat Dione Barbosa to hold her spot in the top 15, and would actually rise up a spot from 11 to 10, switching places with the injured Miranda Maverick. And lastly, we will head to Shanghai Indoor Stadium in Shanghai, China for a light heavyweight division main event between Johnny Walker and Zhang Mingyang. This card would have 6 decisions and 6 finishes. All 6 decisions were unanimous, and of the 6 finishes, 5 were knockouts and 1 was a submission. The lone submission would happen in the first round. 3 of the 5 knockouts would also happen in round 1, and 2 of them in the second round. The light heavyweight, lightweight, featherweight, and flyweight divisions would all have 2 fights each, while the heavyweight, middleweight, welterweight, and bantamweight divisions would all have 1 fight. The 13th ranked Johnny Walker went into enemy territory and took out Zhang Mingyang in front of his home country, and he did so with a second round TKO that would allow him to rise up to number 12 in the light heavyweight division, switching places with Nikita Krylov. And Zhang Mingyang, after suffering his first UFC defeat, would drop from 14 to 15, and Alonzo Minifield would rise from 15 to 14. Aljamain Sterling, the former bantamweight champion, now turned 2-1 featherweight contender, just had a big win at 145 pounds by getting a decision over the 5th ranked former 2-time title challenger Brian Ortega, and they would swap places, Aljo moving from 7 to 5 and Ortega dropping from 5 to 7. And lastly, Charles Johnson would hold his number 15 spot in the flyweight ranking by defeating the undefeated Lonir Kavanaugh, and he did it with a brutal second round knockout that would allow him to not only hold his spot, but actually rise 2 spots up to number 13, forcing Ramazan Tamirov and Bruno Silva both down 1 spot each to 14 and 15. And now that we are done looking at how the rankings were directly impacted in the aftermath of each individual card, let's take a look at the grand scheme of things from a pound-for-pound perspective for the men and women as we head into September. Ilia Topuria, the former featherweight champion turned lightweight champion as of late June, is still holding his spot at the top at number 1. Islam Makhachev, who was the lightweight champion before vacating that belt and having it now around the waist of Ilia Topuria, sits at number 2 as we await his potential matchup against Jack Della Maddalena, rumored to happen in November at Madison Square Garden. The number 3 ranked Merab Dvalishvili is scheduled to have his 3rd title defense of 2025, and that is going to be on October 4th against Corey Sandhagen. Khamzat Chimaev, the new middleweight champion after UFC 319, is now sitting at number 4. As we go down the list a tad bit, we have the 7th ranked Magomed Ankalaev also slated to fight the same night that Merab is fighting against Corey Sandhagen. Ankalaev will be defending his light heavyweight title in a rematch against former champion and current number 10 ranked pound-for-pound fighter Alex Pereira. After losing his belt to Khamzat Chimaev, Dricus du Plessis now finds himself at number 11 in the pound-for-pound rankings, and capping out the top 15 for the men is Shavkat Rakhmonov. And for the women, Valentina Shevchenko still sits at the top of the throne at number 1, although there are a lot of rumors spinning around right now that we may be on the cusp of a super fight between her and Zhang Weili that is closer to happening than we have ever had it before. Zhang Weili does sit at number 2, Kayla Harrison, the other women's champion at bantamweight, sits at number 3, and there are a few ladies throughout this top 15 that do have matchups booked for the near future. That's Manon Fior, Erin Blanchfield, and Tatiana Suarez. Tatiana being the one coming up the quickest, that's at Noche UFC against Amanda Lemos, who sits at number 14, and capping out the top 15 is still Macy Barber. Now let's bring all of those numbers that we talked about earlier, card by card, and put them all together for our monthly totals. Since there were 12 fights on all 4 cards, let's do some basic multiplication. 12 times 4 is 48. That's how many fights there were in the month of August for 2025 for the UFC, with 16 of them being by knockout, 7 of them by submission, and 25 decisions, meaning that 23 of the 48 were by way of stoppage, bringing us to a 47.9% finish rate. For the 16 knockouts, 12 of them happened in the opening round, with 4 of them in the second round. There were 2 submissions in round 1, 4 submissions in round 2, and 1 in the 4th. And out of the 25 decisions, 21 of them were unanimously agreed upon by the judges, while 4 of them would see the judges differ with a split. The middleweight division was the weight class with the most amount of action in the month of August, having 9 fights, 3 above the second closest weight classes, which were the lightweight, featherweight, and flyweight divisions, with 6 fights each. We would see 5 fights at the bantamweight division, 4 fights in the light heavyweight division, 3 fights at strawweight, 2 fights at women's flyweight and women's bantamweight, and something that we are getting used to at this point in 2025, the heavyweight division coming in with the least amount of action in the month, and there was just 1 fight, and that was at UFC Shanghai, the final card of the month, between Waldo Cortez Acosta and Sergey Pavlovich. In terms of what newcomers to the UFC got victories in their debut fights, there were 2 of them, one of which was at UFC 319, and that was Singer Sursukayev, who would get a second round submission over fellow debutant Eric Nolan. That was in the middleweight division, and Sursukayev is definitely someone to keep your eyes on because he's out of the Khamzat Chimaev camp. And if you didn't hear or you forgot, that is the same man who fought 4 days prior to UFC 319 on Dana White Contender Series, where he would earn a contract with a first round knockout. And that fight on Tuesday night was also on 4 days notice. Dana White is huge on this guy, so look for him to be catapulted on a rocket ship to the moon. And the other debut came at UFC Shanghai, as we would see Naraji Taya Lake get a finish win over Kiefer Crosby with a first round TKO, and they are in the welterweight division. So that's it for the month of August. What do we have to look forward to in the month of September? Well, there's going to be 3 events. It starts off in Paris, France for UFC Paris, headlined by the country's own Nassourdine Imavov and Caio Baralho. That's number 2 versus number 7, a potential middleweight championship fight on the line. Then we will have the 3rd consecutive Noche UFC card, this one happening in San Antonio, Texas at the Frostbank Center, and it will be headlined by Diego Lopez, the number 2 ranked featherweight in the world, and the 10th ranked fighting nerd John Silva. Then there will be a week off on September 20th, and finishing out the month will be September 27th in Perth, Australia, as we will see the number 3 ranked Carlos Alberg, who is on a massive win streak right now at light heavyweight, taking on the number 8 ranked Dominic Reyes, who finds himself on a career resurgence. So that is it for this month's edition of The State of the UFC, and I want to get all of your thoughts and takeaways from the month of August down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, because we are currently on the road to reaching 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year, and any and all support is greatly appreciated. Alongside with this monthly video series, I also do weekly breakdowns and previews of the biggest and best fights and storylines. I recap the most meaningful results in the aftermath of every card, and I give my thoughts and opinions on MMA news and fight announcements. You can also join the community on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, as well as like the Facebook page Verbal Sparring MMA, and you can follow on your favorite audio listening platforms such as Spotify and Apple, where podcast episodes release there every Monday and Friday. Have a great week, and I will see you all in the next video.